Yeah, I know what you mean. Okay, I think we're live. So I guess we'll just get started. I thought maybe what we would try this time is if I try to give just a brief skeleton of the whole chapter before we sort of dive into it, and then go back and sort of fill in the parts that we want to fill in. That way, people who haven't read the chapter can at least get a feel for where we're going to be going, or where we hope we're going to be going. So at the end of chapter 2, we had Russell saying that, kind of admitting that you really, really can't be said to know anything about the intrinsic nature of the external world, or an external object like my table, or about matter itself, or about time itself, or space itself, because all you can ever really perceive are your sense data. And so he admitted that there's this epistemic gap here, a gap between experiencing the sense data and the objects that you're perceiving. But he did say that there is this correspondence between the relations among your sense data and the relations among the objects in the external world, and that's something that you can know about, granting some small assumptions. And chapter 3 was about that, and him giving his reasons for that. So he kind of concludes that with, I found a quote. So, thus we find that although the relations of physical objects have all sorts of knowable properties derived from the correspondence with the relations of sense data, the physical objects themselves remain unknown in their intrinsic nature, so far, at least, as can be discovered by means of the senses. Okay, so then he gives the teaser for the next chapter, which is this chapter on idealism. And I think that he's kind of playing with us a little bit. It's almost like he suggests that there's maybe hope. Maybe there's some other way besides using our senses, where maybe through an argument or something, we could really say that we know that the so-called external world has to be this one way, even though we can't learn what that way is using our senses. So that's kind of his teaser, and he leads into chapter 4, where he's going to look at Berkeley's view and see if maybe it can't get out of this hole. Hey. No, you can't come up on the couch. This epistemic hole that we're in. So he ends that by saying it remains to ask whether there are any philosophical arguments enabling us to say that if matter is real, it must be of such and such a nature. Knock it off. So here we are, we're at chapter 4. And we're going to look at Russell's view of Berkeley. I think you could say he kind of grew up on this view. And we're going to see why he's been taking jabs at it. I think he's almost like every chance he gets, he says, oh, in my opinion, fallacious about idealism. So he's going to open chapter 4. Even though he's been doing that, he opens chapter 4 with this little nod about how you have to take it seriously. You shouldn't dismiss it just because it seems strange. And then he gives his brief rendition of it. And then I think he makes 2 main points in this chapter in opposition to it, which when you kind of break it down, maybe breaks down into 3 or 4. And then he ends with his last one, which is also the lead into his next chapter. So in terms of defining the view, his nutshell definition is here on page 17. It's the second sentence of the whole chapter. We shall understand by it the doctrine that whatever exists, or at any rate, what can be known to exist, must be in some sense mental. So, oh, hello, I see we've had some people join. Okay, so he says the grounds that Berkeley used are epistemic grounds. And then he just goes right in and says that Berkeley was right about some things and wrong about other things. Berkeley was right that sense data are mind dependent, but that just means that they don't exist unless you're perceiving, or they quit existing when you aren't perceiving, or they last as long as the duration of your perceiving lasts. And that's sort of what leads him into saying that Berkeley made these errors. And Berkeley's errors are, he was wrong to conclude off of this mind dependence thing, that has to mean that all we can be confident about knowing exists from some episode of perceiving are just those sense data and only those sense data. And that he was wrong to conclude that because sense data are mind dependent in this way, it also means that they have to be in the mind themselves. I think it's interesting that Russell never says where he would put them, but he's definitely not saying yes, they are in the mind, or no, they're not in the mind. He's just saying it's wrong to conclude definitively that they must be in the mind. Okay, so then he explains this point that it's wrong to conclude that everything that exists is mental, based off this idea that sense data must be in the mind. And it's even wrong to conclude that this sort of softer version that at least everything that can be known to exist is mental. So he starts by explaining an equivocation he sees in the way that Berkeley uses the word idea. And we can talk about that. And in preparation for that, he says there's this difference between sense data and physical objects. He reminds us of that. And he's going to make this case by scrutinizing this use of the word idea and show us that, concluding from that, that everything that exists or can be known to exist is mental. That conclusion depends on this equivocation with the word idea. And Berkeley didn't notice this, and that there's this distinction, and that's what I'm going to call his first point. And then his second and last point is he's going to show us another equivocation that he says Berkeley is making, but this time it's with the word no, where Berkeley says, and Russell even calls it a truism, that we can't know something exists unless we know it, or we cannot know that anything exists which we do not know. So he'll say when you tease out that distinction, you can see, in fact, it's possible to know about the existence of a whole lot of things without ever having perceived any sense data about those things. And that happens all the time. And he uses this distinction about the word know as his teaser to go into the next chapter where he talks about acquaintance and description. So that's pretty much my skeleton of the chapter. And I guess we could sort of start at the beginning, or if anyone has any particular thing that they wanted to talk about first, we could start there. So anybody want to mention anything?
I can mention something. It's more along the line of, I'm not sure why he's being so teasing, because it really does.
A lot. He does that a lot.
The only real reason I could come up with half the things that he said was because he was trying to show that there was a certain irrationality to some arguments that people toss up. Not necessarily that he was proving his point, but that the objections that people try to bring up are irrational. And I understand that, because there are certain things that you don't have to prove or disprove. They just are, because there's no rational way to argue against them. And I almost think that he's trying to do that. He's trying to set up the frame of showing that it's not rational for you to argue against these things. And he goes in to show why some of the objections are irrational. And so I hope he's not taking like several chapters just to do that, because I kind of think a lot of people are on that page already. I could be wrong, but I think a lot of people know that there's technically two ways of proving something. Either showing that it's not disproved and yet valid, or showing that you don't need to prove it because it's just like axiomatic, sort of what he said about the mind.
Well, I think something that I'm noticing from reading this book that kind of goes to what you're talking about in sort of the way that he argues is I think this book really can sort of show you this distinction between, or I guess this tradition of analytic philosophy. So he doesn't approach it sort of the way that I think, the way that I approach it, or the way that I think sort of people who are uneducated in philosophy approach, like a new view. And I like this illustration of the way he does it. So I think when I'm hearing some new view or some different view from mine, I'm trying to kind of become the other person and sort of step into the view and look out from the view as if I had the view. And that generates questions that are really different than the kind of questions that we're getting him asking. So I ask questions like, once I get through the clarification questions, so I think I've got the view right well enough, I start asking questions that I think are based on me trying to look out and around at how things would likely seem to have to be if I held the view. So I get questions that I guess come from that. So I'm not really even listening to the specific things, the specific words, the specific sentences, and the way that the specific sentences are expressed by the person who's trying to give me the view. I'm not carefully listening and scrutinizing the words. I'm trying to get a general global feel and then generate questions out of sort of, well, I don't see how it would look that way. So like in idealism, I'm wondering things like, oh, if it's all in the mind, like how can you tell the difference between an illusion or a hallucination? I guess for you, everything's just a veridical case. If it's going to be because of God, then how can you hold this position that you can only learn things from your senses and also hold, these kinds of questions? But Russell's doing something really different, right? He's listening to what the other guy is saying, like from the outside, and he's carefully analyzing what that person is saying and like scanning the words themselves for contradictions and equivocations and things like that. And he's going to find big conceptual, real philosophical problems just by doing that. And that's an approach that some sort of layperson's approach, you're going to just miss that stuff. And that lets him give his objections. They're very clear, they're sharp, and they come really early. And you can't get past this objection just to try to finish your view until you've dealt with this objection. And I think that is sort of the feel of analytic philosophy in this tradition. And you can see it here. He goes right to, well, let's look at the way he says idea. And let's look at how he's using in. And also, what's this about no? He's equivocating on the word no. So just by scanning the sentences, he's finding the deep problems. I think that's interesting. And I think that that's why he's not presenting really seriously just outright, well, I don't think that's the right view. Here's the view I think is right. Instead, he's going, well, if you say that, you can't conclude this. He's kind of picking at it that way.
Yes, and I think he's saying that because Berkeley's view has been or was certainly at the time, I would have think, quite maybe even the consensus view. I don't know. Philosophy seems to have gone that way since Descartes, and maybe this is just a response to that and saying, look, the logic which we all just take as being axiomatic, it shouldn't be axiomatic because of these reasons. I mean, personally, I don't understand idealism. I could never understand it, but you know, and that gives me a big confusion. So when I read Russell, I go, yeah, and you know, I'm waiting for him to go, yeah, because I obviously see that this argument that there's a separate mind source, or the mind is somehow independent of the physical reality of the body. I see as being just non-sequential, I don't see how that follows in any sense in any argument I've ever heard.
I'm not really sure. I didn't know that it was historically a popular view.
I would imagine it was at some point, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was.
Historically, it's sort of like the default theistic position almost.
You think that
Like
idealism?
Descartes, maybe.
Go ahead.
I was just saying for Descartes.
Sure. I mean, he brings up reasons for why it might have been, considered popular or valid back then. But I think it's always important to point out that Russell is writing an introductory book to philosophy, right? I mean, this chapter on idealism is only 3 pages long, and I mean, he can't be expected to sort of blow out every aspect of the theory itself. But I think that's why he takes the time to sort of tell his readers that you shouldn't dismiss it just because on its surface it sort of sounds like an absurd idea. And it's one of the reasons he takes the time to do that is because he feels like people who are reading this aren't really philosophy. They don't have much of a philosophical background, and he has to sort of walk them through why idealism actually held the power that it did.
Russell is pushing his own views, though, as well. Like, he has a sense data theory, which is his own particular view.
I agree that he's pushing it, but I think he's pushing it in the context of an introductory to philosophy, right? So.
And for the very reason that I said is that, I can't understand it, but I don't know why I don't necessarily understand it. But here Russell is giving some explanation as to why intuitively I feel it's wrong. What the actual argument they're giving, why the argument they're giving is incorrect, even though I don't know that. So it's useful for me in that respect as a beginning philosopher.
Is there
naive?
Is there a reason why other forms of idealism were overlooked?
I think it's just what Simon was saying. It's an introductory book. He wants to really talk about all the problems with philosophy. And so he picked the most popular one, and maybe the one that he was the most influenced by.
I mean, does he have later on, does he go on to talk about maybe views on empiricism or something? Because the thing with Berkeley is that he still was a noted empiricist, and it seems like maybe there are views about empiricism that Berkeley came up with that he might want to address later on.
Well,
right?
The title of the next chapter is Knowledge by Acquaintance and Knowledge by Description. And the chapter after that is On Induction. And if he's going on induction and he's going through this kind of history of philosophy, well, obviously that's going to mention Hume almost inevitably, because induction.
Well, no, empiricism. Berkeley was a known empiricist.
So is Hume.
Despite being an idealist. I understand that. But,
I think that you can see him hint at that in this chapter, where he talks about how I think that he explains Berkeley's view that way. Sort of, if you agree, Russell, that we can never experience any physical objects themselves, and that all we ever experience are sense data, or what he calls ideas, then there's no way possible that you could ever experience anything different from an idea, right? So then to Berkeley, it just seems ridiculous as an empiricist to hold that matter exists outside your mind, because even if it did, you could never know that it did. And I think that if you already know about Locke or about empiricism, or the tradition or anything like that, you can find little trails of it. And that's one of the things that is so cool about this book, is that just in these couple of words, he sort of recalls or reaches out to all these other things like the one that you're talking about, Joe, with respect to empiricism, and how Berkeley must hold that if you're going to be an empiricist, you've got to be an idealist. That it seems to be implied.
Could you restate that before? Why is it implied?
It's implied because, as an empiricist, you go by your experience, and that's where you get your knowledge. And some even say that's the only real way to get any knowledge at all. But if you're going to admit that you don't have any direct experience with any kind of external world, that all you ever can experience are your own ideas or sense data, then you don't have any business claiming that there's something outside your mind. Because if there is something outside your mind, you couldn't even know it.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So he does kind of touch on that. So I think what we ought to do now is go right into, and I haven't had a chance to find the exact quotes. I was hoping somebody here had them. Go right into his talk about how there's an equivocation on the way Berkeley uses the word idea, and how that is really what's kind of causing Berkeley to go off on the wrong track, as far as Russell can tell. Does anybody want to talk about that first while I hunt around for the quotes?
Go ahead, Joe.
Um,
I'd rather you do it than me.
Dang-
You're much better.
Well, dang it. Well, okay. Well, I was about to switch to my computer, but what I recall is he sees, like, look, when we say we have some guy on our mind, you know, it's in my mind. I had this guy in my mind all day. We're not actually talking about the physical object. We have the thought of the person in our mind, whereas there can actually be an object that I believe it corresponds with that thought. And so I believe he thinks there could be a distinction in that sense. Whereas Berkeley is saying, no, we have this tree, and it exists in our mind as an idea. And I think he wants to make a distinction between, oh, what is it? I had notes on it. So what does he say?
So before he talks about the equivocation of the word idea, he just says, don't forget that there's a difference between the sensation or the perceiving, the act of perceiving, and the object being perceived. So it's an act-object distinction. And he uses that to segue into this equivocation on idea. Is that what you were talking about, Joe?
Yes. Sorry, yes.
All right, so let's see if I can find it. I have to close a bunch of tabs and pull up the book. So,
Yeah, that seemed to me the link that he was saying that Berkeley had made, is saying that because you couldn't perceive of an object without the perception, therefore the perception must be in somehow synonymous with the object. And obviously that seems like when I say it that way, it seems obviously wrong. So maybe I misunderstand what Berkeley was saying.
No, I think that's right. It totally makes sense. The way that he sort of breaks it down is that, the idea is by Berkeley is originally considered to be in a mind. But Russell sort of says that, like, well, it seems to me like what he means is being before a mind, right? Like not necessarily being in, because we don't have people in our mind, or, we don't actually think that the object itself resides in our mind. And then he goes onto what Helen was saying, that that the ideas are distinct. Well, that idea taken in Berkeley's sense, what is it here? I got it. there is on one hand a thing of which we are aware, say the color of my table, and on the other hand the actual awareness itself, the mental act of apprehending the thing. And so the mental act is undoubtedly mental, but is there any reason to suppose that the thing apprehended is in any sense mental? And so if he makes that distinction, then it becomes clear that that there must be at least a difference, right? That's sort of the suggested relationship of correspondence between the sense data and something external to us. And I'm not sure if he's using that as a way of saying that Berkeley is equivocating in his actual statement, or if he's using that as a way to say that like maybe Berkeley was just misunderstanding the way that ideas come before the mind.
Well, if Berkeley was truly trying to say that you could only be sure that the thoughts were in your mind as having any kind of existence, then Russell's explanation that the sense data is coming to you, you're being assaulted by it, it's not something that is just in your mind, it's coming from somewhere other than you. And that alone indicates that the object being observed can't be entirely in your mind. And I think he was trying to explain that sort of thing.
So let's see here. It doesn't look like anywhere that I can find Russell ever says it can't, that sense data can't be in your mind. Just that you can't conclude definitively that that's where they are. What he says about ideas here is, okay. Berkeley's view that obviously the color must be in the mind, so the sense data or the idea, seems to depend for its plausibility upon confusing the thing apprehended with the act of apprehension. Either of these might be called an idea, and Berkeley probably called them that. And the act is undoubtedly in the mind, like John was saying. Then here's what he says. The act is undoubtedly in the mind. In other words, perceiving or apprehending. Thinking of the act, we readily assent to the view that ideas must be in the mind. Then, forgetting that this was only true when ideas were taken as acts of apprehension, we transfer the proposition that ideas are in the mind to ideas in the other sense, to the things apprehended by our acts of apprehension. Thus, by an unconscious equivocation, we arrive at the conclusion that whatever we can apprehend must be in our minds. This seems to be the true analysis of Berkeley's argument and the ultimate fallacy upon which it rests. So,
mic drop.
It seems to me, I mean, I don't know. I'm worried that I'm not understanding. I could see a direct realist saying this for sure. Look, you're saying that the table is in your mind. But if you're going to say that the thing you perceive are the sense data, I guess that's why he can't go so far as to say sense data aren't in the mind. He wants to leave it open. But so that's why he's just saying, look, sense data don't have to be in the mind. Just because you can't really see the table.
Yeah, I think what he's saying is that sense data can't be necessarily as Berkeley is saying, in which it is only in the mind, and which is, I think, the essence of the idealism, is it not? That it really is only mental concepts that are ever there.
I think I'd go one stage further to say that he's saying, or Russell is implying, I guess, that it can't be mind first. It couldn't be that way around. It can only be the sequence that the sense data, which is in our mind, can't be causing the objects to exist.
Yeah, so what he's saying is essentially what I heard somebody else say was that existence is primary. That these things exist even if you're not there to perceive them.
Indeed, yeah. And that would tell you alone that the objects or the sense data can't be based upon something which is in itself mental, as in of your sense data. It has to be an external sense data of some sort.
Well, Berkeley, he kind of has. This is how he argues for God's existence.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He said God's perceiving them all. You're taking the break from perceiving them.
Well,
Right.
that's how
Yeah,
he justifies the idea. Yeah, is by saying that
That's
because
what I
it's in God's mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was a great failsafe, and it's a good fallback for that objection, right? But I was a little. I mean, I wish kind of Russell had got into how. Like I guess I just really need to look into Berkeley more, Barclay more. But I mean, how the perception of God kind of transfers to us, right? I mean, how do we participate in what is ostensibly a private perception of an entity? And that was what I was trying to figure out, because it seemed like if we take sense data as always being private in that way, how is it that we are sharing a part of it? How does the tree persist just because God is perceiving it? And that was my question as to how the mechanics of that worked. And I'm sure that's most people's questions with idealism.
Well, I think it'd be fair to say that you're partaking in the sense data, but it's not something you are in control of. It is coming to you. And that is sort of one of the first things he established, was the idea that
Right,
you're not really in control of the data coming at you.
Right, but it just seems like the whole argument kind of falls in on itself, right? I mean, we're saying that there's no proof of the existence of the external world because of our sense data, but somehow we infer that that somebody else's sense data could constitute an external world for us. And I think that's a really weird leap to make. That maybe I'm just missing a step there.
No, you're right. It does seem to be begging the question in some way.
Who's constituting the external world? I didn't understand that part.
Well, if it's God's perception that remains constant and makes that tree persist in our perception, right? Like I'm confused as to why that act of perceiving something could be transferred to you, right? Like why would the persistence of that tree in God's perception transfer over to our perception's persistence?
I'm not sure you should use the word transfer.
It's like
that's obviously
participating was the
yeah.
word.
It's weird to say
Yes.
participating.
Even
That word seems weird. Yeah.
The other issue is that there's other people. It says that it exists in our minds, and if it's not something that we know in our minds, it's something that's known in other minds, right? And so it seems like I think that's just where the answer will lie. That's as far as I can think about trying to adjust.
I think Russell does address that, doesn't he, Helena, by saying it's apparent. He uses the word apparent.
Wait. What exactly is addressed by saying that?
Well, when he uses the word apparent, something could be known, but not necessarily apparently. It's not true that it can only be apparently. It could be known through other reasons. There could be other ways of knowing besides just observing something or taking in.
Knowledge by appearance versus knowledge by description.
Say again?
Sorry, I missed that.
Appearance and knowledge by description.
Yeah, I think that's where he's setting up his next chapter here, right? That he's kind of proposing it as an answer. So I don't know, it's weird because it works so well as a step, but I think it doesn't really address some of the stuff that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I have a view as to how I haven't read Berkeley, but maybe it's that God is always perceiving things, like his perception's already there, and whatever we perceive just is a segmented part of God's perception. It's identical to a portion of the perception of all of God, and that's just all we're like. It's like if you have like a telescope, you can look at something, but everything else outside of the telescope's lens can't be seen. You might think God's perception is everything outside of the lens, and your perception is everything within the lens. The whole perception is still there, and your perception just is everything outside of the lens. But
it's funny because I thought of a Minecraft server, and you thought of a telescope. I was like, you've got your own client experience of what's going on in the server, but that map is huge, even places you've never touched. They're all still there, and it can be there if you go there. But you are only able to deal with that which you actually are dealing with. So it's weird how we saw it from two different points of view.
It's cool though.
I'm a little confused.
I'm just trying to work out how Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say how I'm confused. Go ahead. You're trying to work out.
I'm just trying to work out how an idealist view might work. But like, we're forced to use analogies if we don't have like a strict logical way of putting it. Though there are modern idealists who will attempt to use quantum mechanics to do that, like integrated information theory and certain interpretation of quantum mechanics.
Mm.
What exactly was the confusion again? John brought it up.
Well, it's the persistence. The persistence of reality seems based on the continued perspective, right? Like the continued viewing of the world by God, and it seems like that's always going to be a private, like a private bit of information, right? Like if we take sense data as being always private, it does seem like it's harder to see how Berkeley foresees God sharing that with us, or us partaking in that persistent perception of God. I mean, that was my only confusion with it. But it's weird because Berkeley doesn't actually, or because Russell doesn't actually seem to address Berkeley's God argument, right? The entire thing of idealism seems to fall on other grounds. So
it may be because he was just accepting the fact that there is sense data we call ours that is not of our control, that is of something outside of us, and therefore Berkeley concludes that that must be how God sees the world, and we're simply seeing the same thing because he is creating it and making it real just by his existence. And so it doesn't really, like you used the word transfer before, it's not a matter of transferring, it's a matter of us just experiencing the world as God perceives it.
Well, that's what I don't get then, because when I imagine the world, that doesn't make it real. So why would that necessarily correspond to a God?
No idea why that it does. It definitely seems question begging almost. It's like, how does that not make sense? It doesn't work for us. Why does it work for him? Special pleading. I'm sorry. I was saying question begging. I meant special pleading.
I mean, like, again, I'm not an idealist, but you could try to say you appeal to quantum. Like, again, that's like the thing that's inevitably going to happen. But consciousness causes collapse interpretations of quantum mechanics. You could say that God has the ability to choose how things collapse when he observes. So that's creation ex nihilo, I guess. And
well, that would dispute quantum mechanics if somebody knew what the result was. The point of quantum mechanics is we don't know what the result is on any event.
The things still, again, I don't know the mathematics, so I'll just, there are people who try to argue from that perspective. They try to form more rigorous versions of idealism. But I do know that one of the objections is that if the wave function's already collapsed, then it shouldn't be an issue. But like you could maybe like try to argue for macroscopic objects, they already collapsed or something, and there's no particular reason why, like under, say like a multiple worlds interpretation, why we would see the probability assignments that we do and be able to predict anything, because everything that can happen does happen. But under an idealist interpretation, those assignments of probability would make sense because God is in some sense observing things in some way. I don't really know.
Well, that just seems to be equating God with the natural world. So
that's why they would like add in with that integrated information theory and try to show that consciousness necessarily arises from the degrees of integration of information, and so the world itself is in some sense God, but not in a pantheist sense. It would be, the world would be conscious, and we would, and it's weird. It's like
weird. Let's just leave it at weird, shall we?
Well, idealism is necessarily going to be weird, but you could also say any view of God is going to be weird. So,
well, let's getting back to
views are weird.
getting back to Russell and how he's trying or managing, depending on how you look at it, to avoid having to get into all that just by sticking with sort of these language arguments that that expose conceptual problems. Let's talk a little bit longer about this object versus act, because I am a little bit unsure about this with Russell. He's making this distinction between, the act of perceiving and the object that you're perceiving. And he's saying that Berkeley isn't making that distinction, and that's why there's this problem with Berkeley. However, he's been saying that sense data are objects, right? And he's been saying that what he's perceiving, and the only thing he can perceive, are sense data. So when he says, look, Berkeley, the tree's not in your mind, it's just the idea of the tree that's in your mind. It looks to me like he's kind of being slippery there, because I don't see how it goes to, for example, whether or not the sense data are in your mind. The object that Russell sees isn't the tree. As far as Russell's concerned, he doesn't see the tree either. He just sees a thing that the tree is causing. So making this distinction, if you're going to think that the tree is the actual tree that he's trying to distinguish here, instead of just the sense data of the tree, I don't see how that goes to whether or not Berkeley is wrong, except in this small way, and maybe this is why Russell says it. This way, if you think about it this way, then the tree that's not in, that itself isn't in your mind, doesn't have to be the actual tree. It can just be the sense data of the tree. So Russell could be saying, the object of my perception is the sense data of my tree, and that doesn't have to be in my mind.
Well, maybe
and you, Berkeley, are saying it has to be in my mind because you are you equivocating on the word idea.
Again, more than that, and he's saying, I think Berkeley's saying that it has to exist in the mind first, not just that they have some contemporaneous condition, but without the mind, it couldn't exist outside.
But Russell, outside, right. The tree itself couldn't exist, or the sense data.
Well, Russell's saying that's a better explanation to say that the tree exists outside the mind.
Right. Russell has said previously that it's a better explanation to say that there's something out there that's causing this sense data of a tree,
whereas Berkeley doesn't have any argument like that for why he thinks that the mind becomes before the object, or without the mind the object couldn't exist. Right? So that's the confusion that Berkeley's making. He's saying, look, I'm just going to assume that it's a wash. We don't know which is first, but so therefore, we can look at it both ways and be equally valid. And I think Russell's saying, no, you can't look at them both ways. You can look at it from the way of the object causing the sense data as being the best explanation, but you can't, there's no such argument for saying that the mind goes first before the object, because then we have a whole load of other things to explain, such as sequential order from observation, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, as a way of buttressing that, I mean, he seems to, especially when he gets away from the idea of perception and just to knowing things. I think he thinks that Berkeley's making that mistake, even like making a mistake even in describing how things are known. What does he say after? The faculty of being acquainted with things other than itself is the main characteristic of a mind. An acquaintance with objects essentially consists in a relation between the mind and something other than the mind. It is this that constitutes the mind's power of knowing things. So I mean, he's talking about, like, that distinction between act and object has to be hard and fast, right? We can't use this word idea to describe both of those things, or we sort of lose the very idea of knowing things, or how we can't even really discuss how we know things if that's the case. Because he said something, it's like a tautology. If we end up saying that the idea and the act of, or the object and the act are the same thing, then it's a tautology to say something is before the mind, because everything we know is before the mind in some sense.
I
mean, Russell could just be the one who's equivocating in before and in.
Well, there does seem to me one strange thing that, Berkeley must, if we say Berkeley's an empiricist, then there must be some argument we're missing here. Because, by my reckoning, an empiricist would say, well, obviously they don't, but there seems to be some correlation with materialist in some sense. So does somebody want to say why those two things aren't the same?
Well, it could be that the object, which is the act of perception, in Russell's view, and he's in so if you're a sense data theorist, I guess, and the object, which is the act of apprehension, is the sense data, right? The sense data bears some relationship with reality. It's representing something, or is the sense data of something. But nonetheless, the object of apprehension is this mental thing. The problem then might be, well, all you ever have are sense data, and so you can't really get to the outside, because anything, like, you can't get out of your own mind to
Right. Right, but that's just, again, going back to the word knowledge, isn't it? And what we mean by know.
Well, in the previous chapter, he also
Yeah,
mentioned the idea of not trying to deal in absolutes, but deal with what you can deem as reliable sources of knowledge. So you wouldn't ever try to be so hubris to claim absolute. But as long as you can show it's a reliable system that you're utilizing, then you have a basis for trying to acquire knowledge.
Right.
But like, then as human, you can't really. I'm going too far, so I'll shut up.
Go ahead.
Reliability is something that's equally difficult to demonstrate, because problem of induction and whatnot. But like, that's 2 chapters from now. So
This was always going to be a short chapter, I think.
Well, okay, so I don't know. I guess I can see it both ways. Simon, I don't see him, at least in this chapter, making the point that you were making about which one comes first or anything like that. He's really just saying that this equivocation about idea makes it so that you can put the sense data in the mind, and you make a mistake of saying that that's where the sense data have to be. And once you say that that's where the sense data have to be, then there isn't any reason to suppose that there's anything external to the sense data. And so you should be an idealist if you're an empiricist. And he's pointing out that the problem with that is that there's the experiencing, and then there's the thing that you experience. And if you're going to call both of those things idea, then your language can get sloppy and your thinking can get sloppy. And what, therefore, right? Then you have to realize that sense data don't necessarily have to be in the mind. And if we can't say one way or the other where the sense data are, then you compare the idealist view versus the indirect realist view. And for the reasons in chapters 1 through 3, the indirect realist view is the better view.
Yes, I completely agree. I'd taken it a step further. Yeah, I think what I was saying was an implication, I guess, of what he's saying. But yes, that's how I understood it to be in the chapter.
All right. So if you guys think I've read him fairly, let's move on to his last point, which is his second point, about he says that Berkeley's equivocating on the word no, and that this equivocation makes it so that it seems like this truism that we can't know that something exists unless we know it must be a truism, when in fact, if you pay attention to the equivocation and realize that there's knowledge by acquaintance, which is the sense data kind of knowledge that you get through your senses, and there's other ways to get knowledge, not by acquaintance, then you see that this truism, in fact, isn't true. There are other ways of knowing besides just through your senses. And that he wants to expose this equivocation in Berkeley. If I'm right about that, I have a problem with this too, because it doesn't seem to me like it's like he's missing Berkeley's point.
Yeah, I'm agreeing.
From the way I can tell, right? So, I don't know, do we want to talk a little bit about that? You guys talk about that. I'm going to see if I can find the quote real quick.
I agree completely.
Okay, so rephrase me so I can stall while I look for quotes.
Okay, well, so again, this is related to the point I was making earlier. Russell, he's an indirect realist, but he's basing this stuff on sense data. He has like Barclay. I think he's right that you have to avoid the equivocation and act an object. But Russell's object is just as mental. Objective perception, his sense data is just as mental as Berkeley's idea. If he wants to say that Berkeley
wants to insist
know
that
things outside of your mind by apprehension, it's like, but like by knowledge by acquaintance, you aren't acquainted with things outside of your mind. You're acquainted with your own sense data. In his view, you can never ever be acquainted with things outside of your mind by virtue of his own view, his indirect realism. It's not possible to be acquainted with things outside your mind. Thus, you can't know. This is where I'm agreeing with you. You can't know anything is outside of your mind by knowledge by acquaintance.
I think what he was trying to show is that the sense data is not of your origin. So it's not illogical to then assume that the sense data is coming from something outside of you. And that's the label that he's trying to use, and that's the line he's trying to draw. Whereas Berkeley takes it and says, of course it's coming from outside of you, it's coming from the mind of God. Case closed. And he's saying, well, that's clearly a ridiculous argument because blah, 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 blah. But you still have the knowledge that the sense data is not under your conscious control. It's coming at you.
I mean, like that makes me think of Kant in a way. That still doesn't get you out of idealism per se, I guess. But like then again, Kantian, transcendental idealism is, I guess, a form of realism. I'm not sure. I don't know enough about idealism.
Yeah, I just thought that Russell seems to be done with addressing idealism by the time he brings up this truism. It seems like he was kind of stepping back to maybe a less thorough version of idealism, just what kind of people's general perception of things are, and sort of addressing just maybe the original assumption that things essences are about, what is it, that something's being is about being perceived. It's esse is percipi, I think is how he puts it. And that so he's kind of gone beyond just addressing what Berkeley said is about idealism, and sort of saying that some people would say that it seems obvious that we can't know anything that isn't able to be known by us, and that seems reasonable if you don't think about it too much, but that the equivocation that he's addressing is in that statement rather than in idealism itself.
So, John, you think when he gets to this business about the different kinds of knowing, that he's done? He's not using it in some way to try to bolster his claims that idealism isn't the best way to look at things?
Well, I think he is building off of the arguments he's made. But I don't think that he's addressing Berkeley, right? Because I think he says, like, what is it here? We see that Berkeley's doesn't have any grounds. Like he's wrong in substance as well as in form, and hence his grounds in favor of idealism may be dismissed, and it remains to see whether there are any other grounds. And then he starts a new paragraph. It is often said that as though it were self-evident truism that we cannot know anything that exists which we do not know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to me like a real hard shift in thought process there, where he's sort of given up on sort of looking at the defense of Berkeley and wants more to talk about what people generally think about what they know, or about what it is that's possible to know.
Well, but I don't know, because he's also saying, at least the way I looked at it, Berkeley is making this claim that you can't say that you know that there's this external world, because all you can know are the sense data or the ideas. So you don't have any empirical experience with this so-called outer world. All you've got are these sense data, and you can't know anything about this external world. So it's silly to just claim that there is one. And he's trying to, and Russell's maybe not trying to counter that argument, but he is in saying that that's really not the only way we can know things. There are all kinds of other ways we can know things.
What if he's doing exactly what I mentioned in the very beginning? He's not necessarily going along the lines of his argument. He has an argument in his head, and he's now taking the time to go through what would be the perceived objections to the argument and showing why they are useless.
To go into like more general idealism.
Right. So he's essentially, if he gets down to the end of it and shows that there are no further objections that could be made, and all the objections that could be made are pointless, then whatever my view stands as the only acceptable logical reason, even if he never bothered to prove it through anything.
I agree with that. That's after hearing it read.
It seems like what he's doing. I'm not sure. Maybe we'll learn more later on, but right now that seems what he's doing. He's walking his way through the possible objections, dismissing them, so that he's left with, really, we only have one choice.
Yeah, well, if he's writing the work as an integrated whole, then maybe he's going to reference idealism later on or something. So he's just preparing, he's preempting stuff. Maybe problems of idealism, like other problems, might reemerge at certain points. And so he'll have to address those, but they're not uniquely from Berkeley. Or Berkeley, however you pronounce it. But
So what he's saying about knowing he's not trying to make this point about the two different types of knowing in order to combat idealism, but just to keep the door open.
No, I think it's...
To say that idealism can't close this door. He's not trying to say that because of these two different ways of knowing, there has to be matter, right? He's just saying you can't close the door using this business about not being able to know something exists unless you know it. You can't close the door on the possibility that there's an external world by using that. Because if you look at it, there are these two different kinds of know, and there's all kinds of things that we do know, not by sense experience. So I think he's just trying to keep that door open in the same way as the first argument, where he's saying you can't definitively say that sense data are in the mind. You got to keep that door open. And when all those doors remain open, then the path through all of them accumulate, and you start to see that supposing that there is an external world is the best way to think about things.
I agree. Though I wouldn't say that he's stopped addressing idealism. I think he's more specifically stopped addressing idealism a la Berkeley. But he's still addressing idealism, but yes, he's doing that as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. That's what I took it to be. Just some basic ideas about idealism, I guess. That he's gone through. These are the the standard way of thinking about it. These are the objections to it. Yeah, that helps explain. At the end there, when he's saying what I maybe found a little confusing, when he was saying that they're the Emperor of China. Which other way is he suggesting that you can know things?
By
acquaintance. Yeah. By acquaintance and by description are his two.
Two
by
ways of knowing. Okay, description is the other way. Okay, thank you.
Right.
Maybe you said, of course.
Right, and but even before that, I mean, when he addresses that statement about we can't know anything exists which we do not know. He talks just after that about an assumption people make about the fact that whatever can be known must be able to be known, or that what does he say? In any way is relevant to our experience must be able to be known, and that by implication then that whatever has no importance for us, can't be real. And he sort of addresses that topic in a way to get to that idea of knowing, where he brings up theoretical importance and practical importance. I thought that was an interesting statement. Yeah, it's sort of a throwaway line, but it's an interesting way of putting it. That that there could be something that is maybe not able to be known by us, or could be outside of our direct perception in the way that we think of knowing things, but that could still have some sort of relevance or importance to us, and we would still endeavor to seek for that knowledge anyways. And I thought it was a weird way of putting it, but I thought he was making an interesting point that didn't get enough space in this chapter.
That sounds quite subtle, actually, the way you put it there, and I'm not sure I fully understood it. Could you just elucidate further on it, maybe?
Yeah, I wish Russell would have elucidated further. He even says that like it's to fully present it would be impossible. What is it here? To begin with, there's no reason why we cannot have any practical importance for us should not be real. It is true that theoretical importance is included. Everything real has some importance to us, since as persons desirous of knowing truth in the universe, we have some interest in everything that the universe contains. But this sort of interest is included, and is not the case that matter has no importance for us, provided it exists, even if we cannot know that it exists. We can obviously suspect that it may exist and wonder whether it does, and hence it is connected with our desire for knowledge and has importance for us in satisfying or thwarting this desire. So I don't know, that doesn't really address our ability to know it, but it's interesting that it throws everything back into, well, it still has relevance, right? Even if it is impossible for us to know, we should, we're still talking about something that has relevance as knowledge.
Yeah. Even if it's false.
Yeah, it's like so long. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you, Frank.
Yeah, I was just like, so long as the concept makes sense, and you can mess around with it in your head, then you can question whether or not it pertains to reality, and whether or not we can know if it pertains to reality, and as a result, it can have, I guess, mental practical importance rather than physical practical importance. And mental practical importance just is theoretical practical importance. Theoretical importance. I mean, we can mess around with it in our mind, and we can do stuff with it. Is what I'll shut up.
All right. Well, I think, yeah, I agree with you that that's an interesting statement, and he's saying that there's value in questioning and wondering, besides just knowing for certain. So let's just briefly make sure that we do understand the difference between acquaintance and description, or at least between acquaintance and other ways of knowing. And because that's going to lead us up into the next chapter, and that'll kind of be it. This was a little bit tricky of a chapter, I think. He's being really super careful, just to sort of show that idealism, you don't have to go down the route of idealism, that there's plenty of room for other things, and that taken all together, it's better to adopt indirect realism. So let's talk about this acquaintance, and so knowing that acquaintance knowledge and another kind of knowledge, and I did understand that he was talking about there's this difference between the knowledge you get through experience and this other kind of knowledge, which is knowing that certain propositions are true. But I'm not positive that that's the same as what he's calling descriptive knowledge.
Yeah, acquaintance knowledge and descriptive knowledge would both be kinds of knowledge that, I think, so they're propositional knowledge, but like it's the means by which the knowledge was attained. One was by immediately experiencing it with like your own sense perception, as it were, and the other by, I guess, it being described to you. Maybe he'll go into it more in the next chapter.
Okay, so they're both, you want to say that even if you get something through your sense data, whatever conclusions you draw are going to be propositional. So the distinction really isn't about that, because all of it's knowing that something or other. The distinction is just that acquaintance knowledge you get from directly being next to something, experiencing something with your senses, and descriptive knowledge is attained. He's not doesn't exactly say how, because I think that's going to be the main part of the next chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think he's setting it up with that we can't know anything we can't know statement, right? Because he breaks it down into, what is it? We can never truly judge something with which we are not acquainted exists. And then he goes into why that's clearly false, because of his ideas of description and acquaintance.
Mm-hmm.
And like the hint he gives is that his example with knowing the Empress of China. Right? He knows that she exists, not because he's acquainted with her, and so that just sort of leaves open. Well, what other ways might you know something exists? Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah, because China exists and because they have a monarchy. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I guess it's descriptive then. He's referring to things like mathematics, etc. Would that be fair to say? That's the type of descriptive knowledge.
I think I know too much about the topic that I shouldn't talk about it until the next video.
Yeah, I was going to say we're going to get into that really deeply next time around.
Okay, sorry.
No, that's all right.
I can try to explain to you how I understand it after the hangout if you want.
Or you can bring it up real quick now if you want to. That's fine.
Well, Russell does hint at it, right? So.
Mm-hmm.
Or go ahead.
Okay, so it's been a while since I looked up this stuff. Russell has like a theory of description, which is like deep in logic, and it has some weird logical form, like there exists just one thing of this thing and whatever. I'm not going to go into that, but when he says description, he means, I guess in this case, quite literally, it's been described to you. There are categories that you haven't, like I'm putting in my own words here, but there are categories that you have in your head, and you can mess with them and put them together. And so you can say, okay, imagine China is a monarchy. So I think this isn't how he would view it, but I think there's like issues with his view. But I'm going to shut up because I'm not real. My brain isn't organized right now.
It almost sounds. It almost sounds like you're describing a splitting up of knowledge into different categories in the same way that the term exists is split up to include the idea of something existing as a concept or existing as a physicality. You're describing the knowledge of a thing with the knowledge about that thing. So you know that China exists, you know they have a monarchy, so you know that there's an emperor involved. And this is not anything like, you don't have to know his name, what he looks like, or anything about them, but those are still things you can qualify as saying you know. So there's this knowledge as concept and knowledge as reality or physicality.
Well, I mean, I think Russell would say that, acquaintance, knowledge by acquaintance is obvious, right? It seems like it's sense data or ideas, right? But that he's making this idea of knowledge by description as almost a direct part to that, right? Or the other side of that act, right? So what does he say? What happens in cases where I have true judgment without acquaintance is that the thing is known by me by description, and that in virtue of some general principle, the existence of the thing answering to this description can be inferred from the existence of the thing from which I'm acquainted. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but I mean, he's talking about manipulating a former idea, and then that way we can know things about other objects through things that we were formerly acquainted with.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah. I don't know if this is Russell's view, but I guess like if you were to take that route, you would think that the ultimate source of all knowledge is knowledge by acquaintance, but knowledge by description is just like layered on top of that in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I hope he makes the distinction clearer in the next chapter.
Yeah, I mean, he's already specified that there's this thing, reliable knowledge versus absolute knowledge. So clearly he's going to have to go into that in some greater detail.
I think he does put a qualifier in it as well, but it may be also apparently known by other people that the Emperor of China exists. So that kind of hints to me that there's something else he's saying.
He is such a tease. It is so weird.
Yeah, it's really interesting. All right, so I think we've really gone through the chapter. I have a kind of conclusion, I guess, that he's well, it'll just be a restatement. I think that what he's doing here is telling us how you can't, that these conclusions made by idealists aren't definitive, and that there are problems with them, and that if you weigh all the evidence, chapters 1 through 3, plus these other arguments about the the word idea, the word in, and the word no, you can see how it might look at first blush like you've got to go with idealism. But in fact, you don't. And that's pretty much his main case. It's a really careful sort of you can't say for sure kind of an argument. Does anybody want to add anything? Do you have any other impressions about what you think this chapter is trying to do?
No, I think that's pretty much it so far, as I can follow it up to this point. I haven't read ahead though, so.
Neither have I.
I haven't either have I.
I'm really enjoying it. So
I've read lots of secondhand literature, but never the primary source.
So I'd like to say,
we've got a newcomer who just came in. So is there anything that any of the newcomers would like to add, or anything that the people who haven't spoken yet would like to add?
Well, I think he's saying something a little stronger than what you just said, that the case for idealism isn't sure, because he seems to take it in the chapter that something like Berkeley's master argument or related arguments, that they're sort of predicated along this common sort of idea as to what motivates or gets you to idealism. And so to the extent that he can attack that foundation, then that diminishes a lot of the motivation to be an idealist in the first place. I don't think he's just saying, their case isn't like airtight. It's more like he's saying, well, their case is more like it's got a ton of holes and it's leaking, and you're a sinking ship. So why would you want to stay on that?
yeah, I would agree. It's quite understated the way he says it.
Yeah, having to assure the reader that it's not absurd several times, like isn't really a vote of confidence, right?
But I'm not sure what idealism is. I'm a layman in philosophy.
Try to imagine that there is no physical world. Everything that you perceive is a mental construct of some sort. Even your perception of what you think is the physical world is a mental construct. And the data that's coming from that reality is coming from the mind of God. God is sitting there like a Minecraft server, generating an entire world for you. And you are just, drinking in the information from that server.
How would you tell the difference from that and actual reality, or an actual physical reality?
Well, that's the problem of skepticism.
Yeah. And he has done some work along that line already, that there is a line that should be drawn between a useful level of skepticism and this.
It sounds to me like it sounds to me like the Matrix, and God is the Matrix program.
Kind of.
In a sense,
yeah, in a sense.
Yeah. So anyway, just before we derail off to previous chapters again, which is a habit, I would like to just thank Elena for these readings. I'm finding them really interesting, and they're great to listen to. This one I had to listen to about 5 times, but I think that's probably more due to the subtlety of the chapter than the reading.
Well, I certainly am taking an interpretation. I'm certainly doing it with an interpretation. So reading it is probably going to be easier in terms of getting his thoughts into your head. But I am really glad to hear that you like them.
I do enjoy them very much. Yes. More giggles, please, is what I would say.
I can't help but giggle at some of the things he says.
Yeah, I love it. I love it because I'm thinking the same thing. So,
out of curiosity, Helena, or I don't know if it was you or someone else, are you reading Searle's new book on direct realism by any chance? Because I think it makes kind of an interesting contrast. Because I mean, with Russell, like in the chapters before, in this, like he's assuming, like what the previous speaker said about this question about like assume things seemed as they are, but there's no physical reality. You know, a direct realist like Searle would just take that to be sort of a malformed or a nonsensical idea. There is no mental intermediate or sense datum by which you perceive the world. You're in the world.
Yes, I am reading through that book, and I would love to do a hangout on the arguments against sense data and in favor of direct realism.
I would like to participate in that hangout.
So yes, I am reading that book about perception. It's a relatively new book, and I'm enjoying it very much. I'm going to read it maybe one more time with respect to what he's saying about intentionality and whether perception should be thought of as being what he calls intentionalistic, to make sure that we don't think he means intentional. Because that one really, I'm not sure. I can see how you could think of it that way. And maybe that's the better way to think about it. So I am reading that. Have you read it already?
No, I was considering reading it. I was just curious because I think you had either in Discord or maybe on your G+ page, I think you might have mentioned the book before. I just thought it was relevant because a lot of Russell's discussion up to this point in the book, and he gets at it in the very first chapter, like on appearance and reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's framing these questions about idealism and skepticism and perception and whatnot in terms of sense data.
Mm-hmm.
And so that lets you get certain skeptical issues, that lets you question, like, what kind of thing is matter? Does matter exist? You know, is there really a table? That sort of thing. And within that paradigm, you know, Russell tries to rescue some kind of realism against the skeptical and idealist threat. But I just thought it was interesting because, I mean, especially I think these days, a lot of philosophers of perception are inclined to accept something like direct realism. So they would get off they would basically get off that line of reasoning much earlier than someone like Russell. Like Russell seems to agree with the skeptics and the idealists that there is this appearance reality gap of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And the skeptic or the idealist wants to deny that there's either that we can know what's behind appearances or that there's anything over and above appearances in the case of the idealist.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a direct realist would just reject the whole ontology and philosophy that undergirds that thought process in the first place. So that question that was brought up before, you know, imagine things seemed as they are, but there was, you know, nothing physical, you know, there weren't actually tables, chairs, or whatever. I think for a direct realist, that question doesn't make sense.
That's right. I agree 100%. Well, I want to organize a hangout like that. I definitely want to get finished with this book though, because it's hard. I mean, what are you going to say about illusions? You know, blah blah blah. So I think it would be a great hangout to do. And I, of course, agree. He's not even using direct realism or presenting it at all. He got rid of that.
No, I'm just saying that I think it would make an interesting counterpoint. Like after you get through this book, like it would be kind of interesting to see how someone else approaches some of these very same related issues, but has a very different take on it, like Searle apparently seems to.
I think that's a great suggestion, and I will take you up on it. All right, so at this point, I think we can end the hangout for this chapter, and we will see you guys next week, unless anybody else wanted to say anything else as a last comment.
Yeah, I posted something in the group chat. I want to promote. Maybe that's nothing to do with this topic, or maybe it does. It is a TED Talk called "Do We See Reality as It Is" by Donald Hoffman, and it's a very good talk. I recommend seeing it. It's basically that we evolve to not see reality as it is, but to make our approximation of it, so that we can survive at least. Have you heard Steve saying that color is not really a thing in reality? It's just a construct of our mind when we see electromagnetic waves. So it's almost the same thing as this.
Indeed. Yeah, and we talked about that a little bit from this book as well.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you for the recommendation. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and we'll see you next week.